Welcome to the first ever edition of Brooke Army Medical Center's podcast, BAMC's Golden Hour. I'm Elaine Sanchez, Public Affairs Officer for Brooke Army Medical Center, more commonly known as BAMC. We are excited to launch BAMC's Golden Hour podcast to showcase our latest and greatest programs, services, and innovations. In case you're new to military medicine or the military in general, BAMC is the largest medical facility and the only Level 1 trauma center in the Department of Defense. With over 8,600 military, civilian, and contract personnel, we have a vast array of experts, many renowned in their field. We can't wait to share their knowledge and groundbreaking achievements with you. Here at BAMC's Golden Hour, we do have a few ground rules. First, no acronyms, with the exception of BAMC. Second, we will do our best to explain medical or scientific terms to avoid confusion, mostly on my part. Finally, our guests are required to play a game. Today, in light of the ongoing pandemic, we are devoting our first episode of BAMC's Golden Hour to discussing the COVID-19 vaccine, focusing mainly on the science behind it. And speaking of renowned experts, we are incredibly fortunate to have one of the key players in BAMC's COVID vaccine program with us here today, Air Force Colonel Heather Yoon, BAMC's Deputy Commander for Medical Services and an infectious disease physician. Colonel Yoon, welcome to BAMC's Golden Hour.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here. To start, can you tell us a little about yourself? What got you interested in the infectious disease field?
Thanks. Yeah, well, what about me? I grew up mostly in Western Colorado. I am a mom. I have 3 kids, wonderful husband, and really became interested in infectious diseases as a medical student. Had a wonderful teacher in microbiology who highlighted really how everything involving infectious diseases was connected to something else. It was connected to a story, but it was also connected to things like movement of people and wars and climate change and what happened with animal populations. And, you know, somebody decides to get their water from one place instead of another. Somebody decides to hang around with a new group of people. But every infectious disease story is really tied in with so many other things, which I think we're really seeing that play out with this pandemic too. And then as a military physician, you know, infectious diseases are a global health security concern, and they've really been highlighted. In fact, viral diseases of pandemic potential have been highlighted in national security strategy as a thing that's a threat to even our own national security, and we're seeing that play out as well. So really great relevance to being a military doctor.
Fantastic, ma'am. Thank you so much. Great background. Yeah, we actually, I recall doing an exercise here at BAMC with the city where we did a kind of a global pandemic overall exercise. Is that correct?
That's right. That was not much more than a year ago, actually. It was just a nice little dress rehearsal.
Yes, ma'am. So that kind of brings me to the next question. Did the impact and scope of the pandemic surprise you? I'm guessing not.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think to see something like this actually play out, I mean, it's a shock for everyone to a certain extent. I think everybody has had to deal with all kinds of surprises in their life created by this pandemic. You know, the ID community has sort of been predicting a pandemic like this for a long time. We know that coronaviruses cross over into human populations from animals. We've seen that a couple of times in even recent decades with SARS and the MERS coronavirus, and I just used 2 acronyms for you. Sorry, I can't follow your rules.
We need you to go back and actually say the terms. What does it mean?
Okay, so MERS coronavirus is the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, and SARS was severe acute respiratory syndrome. So those were viruses caused by emerging coronaviruses crossing over from animal populations into human populations. And so we knew that this was a potential thing. There were some reasons that we kind of got lucky with those viruses, that they didn't cause pandemics. So in a way, this event has been predicted. We've been overdue for a global pandemic of a respiratory disease for a few years already. But nevertheless, I think it's still rather astonishing, just the impact of this on our world and our society. And we've just crested 420,000 deaths today in the United States. And I don't know that it's possible to hear a number like that without astonishment.
Agreed. It is absolutely devastating how impactful it has been. Thank you for that, ma'am. Moving to the COVID vaccine. For many, the COVID vaccine seemed to arrive at warp speed, no pun intended. Do you think it was rushed to completion? Because I do seem to hear that quite a bit, that people feel like it was because of the speed that it came to the public. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and it's one that we hear a lot also. And to put it into context, yeah, this vaccine really, time from conception to actually getting FDA an emergency use authorization and getting shots into arms, really so much more quickly developed than any other vaccine that we've ever had before. That being said, I think there was a lot of background work done that many people aren't necessarily aware of. So I mentioned earlier those 2 other coronaviruses that have crossed over in recent decades into human populations from animal populations. Those essentially did serve as dress rehearsals for this event because it gave scientists the heads up really that coronaviruses could be a real serious problem and that we needed to start working on vaccines. But that work really laid the groundwork for this, as well as parallel lines of effort around messenger RNA vaccines that was being done for a variety of things, including cancer. So when this virus emerged, really all they needed to do was get the genome of it and get the genes for that spike protein, which everybody already knew that worked with coronaviruses and immunology before this, that was going to be the money target to go after. So from then, it was just a matter of really putting that into the recipe to get the right messenger RNA so that we could have this foundation to build on.
Very interesting. I just want to go back to one term you used because I don't have a medical or infectious disease background. I'm sure many of our listeners don't either. Messenger RNA. Can you kind of give a layman's explanation of that?
So messenger RNA is essentially like a temporary message to the machinery of a human cell that produce proteins. So in your own cellular workings, you have a nucleus of the cell, which is where your DNA is, and that's your permanent genetic material that's just you and you carry it around with you forever. And then you've got these protein manufacturing machinery out in the rest of the cell, but you've got to have a way for the DNA to communicate with those machines for making proteins. They're called ribosomes. And the messenger RNA is the intermediary. I've used before, it's almost like an email, except it's not an email because emails are permanent. It's more like a Snapchat, a very temporary message that's fleeting and it goes away after a little bit. So that's how your own cells communicate with your ribosomes to make proteins. That's how viruses communicate with your own ribosomes. So we're using the same kind of machinery that a virus would hijack if it came into your body to produce its own proteins that it needed to replicate itself. And then what this messenger RNA vaccine does is it tells those ribosomes how to make the spike protein that is how the coronavirus attaches to your cells. That also happens to be the target on a coronavirus that your body produces antibodies against. So it's a very effective target at preventing attachment and at generating immunity.
Great explanation. I love the social media analogies. What's interesting to me, and you mentioned how just such a huge effort that created this immunization, and because of this huge scientific and research effort, is that why it's so effective? Because the efficacy is great, and is the efficacy better than other virus vaccinations?
Yeah, the efficacy is really a lot better than a lot of vaccinations. I mean, vaccinations, there's a pretty widespread of efficacy, honestly. But this far exceeded the initial expectations and even the target set by the Food and Drug Administration. They were prepared to offer emergency use authorization to any vaccine candidate that was safe, that could be demonstrated at least 50% efficacy. And these 2 that we already have on the market, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, are both over 90%, closer to 95% efficacy. Why are they so good? Gosh, it probably has to do with the stability of this coronavirus spike protein, but probably something having to do with the messenger RNA technology itself. And this is me spitballing a little bit, you know, we'll have to see how it goes with other ones, but the way that this is processed through the cell and then presented as an antigen, which is like a stimulus for the body's immune system to try to attack, it generates antibodies, but it also stimulates some of the other cellular immune processes that are harder to study, but probably more important for long-term immunity and for stable immunity. So the short answer is, I don't know why they're so good. I have some thoughts, but I certainly am grateful, and a lot of ID doctors will get almost delirious just talking about the efficacy of these vaccines because they're so much better than we thought they might be when we started with this.
Awesome, thank you. And I have a much better understanding now of infectious disease and science. As we know, there is some vaccine reluctance out there despite all the research and data. A recent Pew Research poll asked people about their attitude regarding the vaccine. Overall, 60% of Americans say they would get the vaccine. Close to 40% say they will definitely or probably would not get the vaccine. So it's a pretty good. 60% say they get it, 40% maybe not. 20% of US adults do not intend to get vaccinated and are pretty certain more information will not change their mind. Sounds like a mix of wait and see or maybe just no go. Just one poll, but it's an indicator that people are apprehensive. How do you think we can get past some of this vaccine reluctance?
Boy, that's such a good question. And of course, vaccine reluctance predated the COVID vaccine, right? This is not an original concept in the history of the world that people would have some kind of concerns or second thoughts about vaccines. And I think it's totally understandable given, you know, everything that's going on in the world and frankly, trust problems, right? Let's call a spade a spade. I think a lot of people don't know who to trust right now. It's been a weird year. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of bad information. And even some of the institutions that we sort of historically have trusted without a second thought, people have called that into question. So I think all of that plays into it. You know, to me, really the best strategy for addressing concerns is just conversations with people to try to understand what are their specific concerns. And if you can do that with a trusted agent, all the better, because unfortunately, you know, your aunt on social media who has a friend, who has a cousin, who has a daughter, who had something bad happen, like that might not be the best, most reliable source of information, but it's somebody that they know and trust. And so it sort of comes across as more personal a message than whatever the CDC, who even are they? We don't know them. So I think individual messages with trusted agents and not shaming people, you know, I think it's normal for people to have concerns. We just need to hear what they are and answer them, you know, as best as we can with transparency about what we know and what we don't know, because there's plenty that we don't know. Part of being a scientist is just continuous learning and humility about, gosh, I don't know everything, and what I'm telling you today might change a little bit 6 months from now, or even a lot. None of us had really thought about this disease much at all 14 months ago. It didn't exist. So I think just continuing to beat the drum of information and making sure that people get information that's the right stuff to address their own particular concerns at the level that they can understand it. Sometimes we hear explanations that are overly simplistic, and I don't think that really is good for anybody. It speaks down to them. But people have the ability to process and learn all kinds of information. We just need to trust them with it.
Great point. And hopefully the information will help turn people around. What about the folks that are kind of more wait and see? And I always think of this in terms of technology. You have your early adopters, and then you have your folks that are not going to wait in line at the technology store for hours. I mean, do you think there's some of that that kind of attitude out there?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, once they see, again, like their community and their doctors and their leaders and the people that they trust getting this vaccine and then going about their lives, and, you know, they didn't grow a third eye. Surprise, everything's fine. I think that will bring some people along just as late adopters. I have a particular sense of urgency about don't wait too long, though, because the fact is we're in the middle of a global pandemic and we have thousands of cases diagnosed in our community every single day. And so every time you walk out of the door, every time anybody in your household walks out of the door, it's a little bit of a roulette game of how lucky are you going to get and for how long. And you just don't know. There's no way to predict. So think about it, consider the facts. And I have a sense of urgency about making sure that I'm communicating this information so that people can be informed as quickly as possible.
Well, that sounds like a good endorsement to me. So thank you so much for that. We will take a short break, and when we come back, it's game time.
Yes.
Check out Brooke Army Medical Center's social media pages like Instagram. Follow us and stay connected with BAMC. Facebook. Be in the know. Brooke Army Medical Center is all over social media. LinkedIn. Stay up to date on your healthcare and more. Stay connected. Twitter. Stay up to date with videos, stories, command headlines, live events. YouTube. Search for Brooke Army Medical Center. Stay up to date on your healthcare and more by following us on any of our social media platforms.
And we are back with Colonel Yoon, and it's game time. Colonel Yoon and I will be playing a game of True or False, COVID edition. I'm going to read a series of statements. If it's true, Colonel Yoon will hit this buzzer. If it's false, she'll hit this buzzer. Colonel Yoon, are you ready?
I think I'm ready, Elaine.
It's time for True or False, COVID edition. First statement, I already had COVID and recovered. I'm immune and I don't need the vaccine.
So that is false, and I'm confident about this one. We know that actually, even with the short period of time that we've been following people that have had COVID since this all started, that actually people can get reinfected. It's been demonstrated definitively several times. And you can see antibody levels wane after just a few months. Some people never really get high levels of antibody, even with a natural infection with COVID, depending on, you know, how many symptoms they had and their age and whatever immune status. But definitely what's being recommended is that even if you've recovered from COVID, you can go ahead and get the vaccine. And you can really get it as early as when you come out of isolation after having had COVID. We get a lot of questions even about timing of the second dose. Just go ahead and get it when you come out of isolation and you're good to go.
Great advice. Next statement, I got my vaccine, so I no longer need a mask.
Okay, so this one is false also so far. And this is one that I wouldn't be surprised if you ask me again in 6 months and I give you a different answer. And the reason for that is really because everybody's still in the process of collecting information about this. The trials, the way that they were designed was really to evaluate how well did these vaccines prevent disease, which is illness in people. They didn't go after so much how much did they prevent transmission. And there are some good reasons for that because it's a harder study to do and it takes longer and time was of the essence. And they didn't go after so much asymptomatic infection either. Although those trials are currently being done and we'll have more data about that. In the meantime, we're wearing masks out of an abundance of caution because the stakes are high and we're in a pandemic and we don't want to give each other COVID accidentally. I will say that it's incredibly unusual for a vaccine to prevent disease and not also prevent infection. And editorializing, I think, in all likelihood, it prevents most infections and most cases of transmission. But I can't tell you how much because the studies haven't been done yet. In the meantime, we're all wearing masks.
So this is a temporary false.
For now.
Next one, you are more likely to experience side effects after the second dose.
Okay, so that one is true. And that was demonstrated in the studies that have been done, and it's been demonstrated in our personal experience, I think, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, for me too. Definitely the second dose was a little bit more of like a, wow, I had an immune response. And that's why. It's because the first time your body sees COVID protein, the spike protein, it's kind of like, wow, what's going on here? And the second time it's ready, and it's like, no, I remember you, you're not getting through here again.
Excellent. Next statement, more people will die from vaccine side effects than will die from the virus itself.
So that is a big time false. And currently the scoreboard is amazing. Like, the vaccine could never catch up. If it's a contest of deaths, so far in the United States, what are we up to in terms of numbers of COVID cases? Something like 29 million. And 29 million cases in the United States and 421,000 deaths from COVID. And in the world, as of today, we have 69 million doses of vaccine given. And guess how many deaths from the vaccine? That would be 0. So 421,000 divided by 0 is approximately infinity. I remember that from math. Even if it doesn't end up being exactly infinity times more likely to make you die getting COVID than the vaccine, it's going to be something that is so high that the vaccine will never catch up in terms of killing people. I can answer that one very confidently.
Obviously, thank you very much. Very confident. The COVID vaccine will alter my DNA.
So that's false. It doesn't really have any mechanism for doing that.
Okay, that was a quick false. I can still get the vaccine even though I have underlying health problems.
That is true. And that is one that we get a lot of questions about. Should I get the vaccine even though I have cancer? Should I get it even though I have lupus? Should I get it even though I have diabetes, or I'm 90 years old, or pretty much the whatever should I get it if I have? The answer is yes. The only people who shouldn't get the vaccine are people who have a history of severe allergic reactions to the vaccine or to one of its components, which it's a pretty short list. So chances are there are not many people around with a contraindication.
Excellent. This next one's a little long. The COVID vaccine contains one or more of the following: live or whole coronavirus, microchips, tracer technology, fetal tissue, stem cells, mercury, aluminum, the mark of the beast, pork products, or preservatives.
That was a really long list, but I'm going with false. I have seen the ingredient list for all of these, and it's actually a pretty short ingredient list, shorter than the list of ingredients in the bread that I had my lunchtime sandwich from. And there's no mark of the beast contained herein, and none of these other things are present in coronavirus vaccine.
Good to know, Colonel Yoon.
You're welcome.
And you've been a great sport. Thank you for playing our game of True or False, COVID edition.
What did I win?
I'll get back to you on that, ma'am.
Okay.
Time for a quick break.
Keep an eye out for Brooke Army Medical Center's virtual town hall on Facebook Live. Every month, Brooke Army Medical Center hosts a Facebook Live virtual town hall starring a panel of specialists in their respective fields, experts, department leaders, chiefs, deputies, the command sergeant major, and the commanding general. Ask questions and get answers. Be on the lookout for Brooke Army Medical Center's virtual town hall on Facebook Live. Join the conversation.
And we are back and joined by another special guest. We have Major Laura Wyatt, who serves as a critical care nurse in BAMC's COVID ward. We asked Major Wyatt to stop by to discuss her experiences with the COVID vaccine. Major Wyatt, thank you for joining us for BAMC's Golden Hour.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Wonderful. And Colonel Yoon, we still have you here, so please feel free to chime in whenever you'd like. So Major Wyatt, we're going to talk to you about the COVID vaccine. But first, can you tell us a little about yourself and your role at BAMC?
A little bit about myself. I am a critical care nurse, as you mentioned. I have been in nursing for the last 13 years, dual military. I also have some children who I definitely want to keep away from COVID. And my role at BAMC is I go where the fight is, basically. I've been one of the OICs for our few COVID units. I'm sorry. I failed. I certainly can. I have been one of the clinical nurse officers in charge of any one of our many COVID units that we have had to stand up during this pandemic. And my current role is overseeing the intensive care unit / progressive care unit.
Stay away from the acronyms there. Nice job, ma'am.
I'm trying. It's hard.
So we know you got the COVID vaccine. That's why we have you here to talk about it. So why did you decide to get the COVID vaccine in the first place?
That was a tough one for me. When I heard about the case in the United Kingdom of a patient who was going through the trials and ended up severely ill, it really put me on the back burner for thinking that I might want to get it versus deciding to get it. So what ultimately led to my decision was that was just one person out of hundreds and thousands of people. Well, I think at the time it was really only maybe tens of thousands of people who started in the phase 3 trials. Not only that, but the research behind the development of the vaccine, I'm a numbers person, and numbers don't lie. So when you have an overwhelming majority of success with this vaccine that was just released versus, you know, the flu vaccine that we have to get every year, it spoke for itself at that point. The CDC, as well as the Food and Drug Administration, put forth a lot of mandates to make sure that we as a community or as a population were safe in the administration under this emergency use authorization. So I felt a little bit more comfort in that. And as a nurse and seeing my cohorts fall left and right and also deploy and mobilize in COVID efforts around the United States, then our numbers were dwindling down. And if I got sick, I can't be in the fight with them. I showed no support to BAMC. So that's I think ultimately the biggest reason why I went ahead and took the shot.
If I could jump in, and you work in the COVID ICU, so you know, you on the spectrum of people who are familiar with what COVID can actually do to people, you know, you're more familiar, I think, than a lot of folks out there. How do you think that perspective factored into your decision to get this vaccine, if at all?
It was definitely a motivating factor. This disease, I mean, I haven't been in nursing as long as some of the other people I work with, who I absolutely respect, but this disease has killed people faster than I have ever seen. I think the only thing comparable is just in a deployed setting where it's combat related versus an illness that has sent someone to their demise. I've never seen anything like it, and it was terrifying.
Excellent, great question. So have you had both doses already?
Oh yes, ma'am, I sure have.
All right, very good. How did you feel after each one? What were the side effects like for you?
Very different. Dose 1 I received at the end of December, and I was strategizing, trying to make sure that I got it towards the weekend in case I did have side effects. I could rest, take my Motrin, and be fine for the next work week. But surprisingly, after dose 1, I had no side effects whatsoever. A little sore arm, but that was to be expected, like with any other vaccine. And then I got dose 2 last week. And within the first 24 hours, just after 12 hours of having received it, I was not feeling well. I started to have the chills, followed by some body aches, and then the body aches got a little bit more severe. I did have a low-grade fever, but it was absolutely nothing that some Motrin or some Tylenol couldn't handle. A little bit of TLC from the family, and I was good to go.
Does that sound in the range of normality, Colonel Yoon?
Absolutely, and that's really what they saw in the trials too, was that the second dose was more likely to stimulate those kinds of symptoms of an immune response, with fatigue and chills and muscle aches and all that being more prevalent after the second one. And that was my experience too after my second dose. The first one I just had a little sore arm. And the second one, I was like, yep, I definitely, immune system is working today, and we will be ready when the real thing comes around.
I like that. So, Major Wyatt, what would you tell other people who are still on the fence about getting the vaccine?
Get it.
I like that.
I've heard everything, and I'm so surprised at some of my cohorts, what they say. You know, I'm gonna grow a horn in the middle of my head, or now the government can track you everywhere you go. Well, I mean, they could have this whole time, but it's not.
You're in the military, Major Wyatt. Let's be honest.
They know exactly where I am. It's just not realistic. The science behind it speaks for itself. If we really want to put an end to this, or at least start to flatten the curve globally, we need to do our parts and get vaccinated. There's research that backs this up 100%. So if you're on the fence about it, just get it done. And I do realize that some of my other cohorts who are on the fence about it, or kind of against it, I guess, feel like it's more of an empowerment to be able to say, no, this is one shot that I don't have to get, so I'm not going to get it. But that's not really the right answer either. We are still in the middle of a global pandemic, and we have to do everything that we can to put a stop to it.
Absolutely. And it is voluntary under the emergency use authorization, just definitely encouraged, right, Colonel Yoon?
Right.
Okay. Just wanted to add that in there. Thank you so much, Major Wyatt, for being here today. Colonel Yoon, thank you so much for being here today as well and taking the time. Before we conclude, any final parting words for us? Any words of wisdom?
Gosh, well, yeah, from my perspective, really my exhortation to everyone really is just to look at the data yourself. Go to reputable sources of information. Make up your own mind. And just because you already decided to get it and you already got it, doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about it anymore, actually, or that you shouldn't look at the data or kind of keep up with this, because it's really on all of us to be informed, because everybody around us has questions. We don't get to just sit and be like, that's fine, I'll take care of myself and not worry about anybody else. We have to keep worrying about everybody else. We're really all in this together, and no one is completely safe until all of us are safe. But you know, getting that second dose of the vaccine and watching in the data really how that 95% protection happens about a week after the second dose, you know, it was really an amazing feeling. It was kind of almost like crossing the finish line at a marathon or something like that. And it doesn't mean the pandemic's over. It doesn't mean that I don't still have to wear a mask or, you know, modify my behaviors. I mean, really my life hasn't changed that much. But the knowledge that I'm really not going to end up in the ICU from this disease, that's not going to happen to me. That's kind of an amazing feeling. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to bring this virus home to my family at this point. I'm pretty sure that I'm not going to be a threat to the vulnerable people around me or my patients. And that's a truly amazing feeling after 10 months of having some smoldering low-level anxiety about that.
Yeah, it's like both of you said, there's a huge amount of science behind it, and there's also that emotional factor. You're not just helping yourself, but you're helping society. And that's a great feeling to know that you're helping your community and your society and the whole world. So it's a wonderful thing. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, thank you. Colonel Yoon is the expert in everything. I followed her, every clinical advice she had during all of our town halls. You know, it goes a long way. So I really hope that everyone else has a chance to listen to those and get their vaccine.
Thank you. Thank you for the plug for our BAMC Facebook Live town halls. You can find them on BAMC's Facebook site. Thank you to our special guests, Colonel Heather Yoon and Major Laura Wyatt, for the great information. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in for our first edition of BAMC's Golden Hour. Please keep an eye out for the next episode. In the meantime, we want to hear from you and how we are doing. Please leave your input, questions, or suggestions in the comments section below. Thank you again for tuning into BAMC's Golden Hour, a time for military medicine to shine.